Welcome back to the Blink Weekly Newsletter. I'm Bianca Lager. I'm a fractional executive, a keynote speaker, and an online course creator, and I help companies who are ready for executive excellence through team empowerment. Now, you subscribe to my newsletter and you will get tips on leadership and how to navigate through tricky career conversations and business moves. So let's get in to our one-on-one with Bianca Lager with the question of the week. Question of the week is, what do you think about someone with 15 plus years of corporate experience going to work for a startup? I'm feeling pretty I'm feeling pretty over all the politics and approvals that I've experienced at the 4 corporations I've worked for since graduating college. I'm a manager and I'm on the path to becoming a director, which is considered senior leadership at my company. But lately, I just feel like leaving it all behind. And I always hear about friends' journeys on cool startups, having fun, and cashing in major options. I just feel like I've taken the safe and boring route, and I guess I'm thinking the grass is greener. But is it? I worry it's too late for me to do something drastic like this. Are startups the way to go? Ooh, such a juicy conversation, and certainly I think, it's a big, big question. And some people, I think, just like know who they are inside. When I say that, I think of myself and my sister. My sister is a total corporate person, and she has like no desire to dip her toes in the startup world. And for me, I have always been a small business and startup person. I did dip my toes in the corporate world for several years, and I absolutely hated it. Like, in the depths of my soul, I couldn't stand it. And so there's just different strokes for different folks. I also think there's a sort of maturity level that changes at some time. Some people, you've been doing one thing for so long that you're just like, gosh, like I need to break out, or, you just want something different than what you've been doing for such a long time. Totally understandable and totally reasonable. And I'm just going to kind of walk through as straightforward as I can, a pros and cons list. I'm going to try not to be biased since I'm such a small business and startup person. But I'll tell you this, like, part of my bias is it's not for everyone. It's just simply not. It is it's a situation that really blurs, I think, the lines of boundaries. And startup life is really an all-encompassing life, which has a lot of upsides. So anyway, let me get into it in a more organized way. So I would say this. I would say that when you're thinking about the pros and cons, and let's start with the startup, okay? What is it like working at a startup? Well, yeah, I think you've addressed it. Like, a big pro is there is high growth potential. I mean, not just for those options and things like that, which, I mean, don't get married to the idea of cashing in on options. It happens. It's great. It does not happen regularly or usually. It's not always. It's not a guarantee. And it depends so much on the management of the company, on the product, of the market, and the environment. I mean, there's so many factors, right? And so sometimes that equation works out and sometimes it doesn't. I'll give you a great example. Let's say that you work at a startup for 4 years. And at the end of the day, your options are worth 50 grand. You're like, wow, I go work for this company, get an extra 50 grand on top of my paycheck. Yeah, maybe. I mean, you might have to trade off a lower salary for that. So at the end of the day, average that out of $12,000 or so a year and then actually take taxes off that. So maybe I'll be generous and say 8 grand that you profited. You're calling that, anybody do math for it, $32,000. Over 4 years, did you actually make money, or taking that corporate job, would that have been the same? So when I'm talking about high growth potential, it doesn't necessarily translate to profit for you, or it doesn't translate necessarily to money. It can sometimes, but most importantly, it's professional development growth. Like, there is no place, and I mean, I say this as a person with her MBA, okay? I went to graduate school. I have my MBA, and I will tell you what, working at a startup, running a small business is the true business school that there is. It's the school of hard knocks, and it is the place where you live by the sword and died by the sword. And this is somebody who came in with a business, degree. And so I had a lot of advantage over people who never have experienced that. And still, it's incredibly challenging. It's incredibly dynamic. It leads to so many accelerated learning opportunities. Okay. And what I mean by that is when you're working in a corporate job, the jobs have usually a pretty specific focus. As you gain higher in rank and stuff, you could be running a department. It sounds like you're kind of on that path. And so that is broader, but it generally, you're still sort of responsible for this kind of sector of the business. And when you're working at a startup, you get to learn like for better or worse, whether you want to or not, you get to learn a much broader picture of how this works and how product and marketing work together, how sales, like decisions are made. Like there's all these things that you get to go. And depending on the stage of the startup that you enter into, if you're at early stage, you get to actually make decisions on how all those things happen. And let me tell you, like at that stage, like startups are literally just making shit up. Like, yeah, there's a general blueprint. If you have good investors and good advisors, like, you can make good decisions early on, but you're absolutely experimenting constantly. And so it's super fun, but it's super challenging. And so that's where the growth comes, because you learn things about the way that the marketing department works that if you're a product person, you would never have ever been involved in the corporate world. So that being said, you can advance your career really quickly. Talk about, your 15 years and you're getting into a director role. Yeah, it might be about 2 years into your role into a director at a startup. And those titles, it's not that they're not meaningful, but it's a very different job. It's a very different job, and it's a very different setup, and it's a very different set of expectations. So there is a bit of like title hopping there, so to speak, but it comes with a great deal of experience that you'll just never really get to have at a corporate environment. That being said, that same thing, that innovation and creativity, you get to be involved in problem solving in a way that and this is kind of one of the things I didn't like about corporate life. Like there is not a whole lot of innovation that you get to experiment with when you're part of a really large organization, because there's so many approvals and processes and other people to weigh in on. And it's like that for a reason. But the growth stage of a company is such an exciting experimental time. Corporations that are more advanced like that, they've already been through a lot of that. There's still innovation, they're still developing, they're still being creative, there's still creativity. But in a startup, you have autonomy that you just do not have at a corporation, to where you're like, well, let's try this. And you try it for better or worse. And you don't have the constraints that can kind of come with a more rigid process. With that, you get immediate feedback at a startup and impact. The things that you do, the things that you say, the decisions that you make, they are available for outcomes immediately. And so everything that you do is impacting the company. Now, heavy is the crown, I always say. With that comes a great deal of responsibility, so that, the stakes are pretty high. Whereas in a corporate world, if you're making some errors and stuff, not to say that they're not important or not meaningful, but the impact isn't necessarily reverberated and felt at a super, super impactful level. For better or worse, right? You want to feel like you're making a difference and making an impact at what you do. It's just felt at a smaller level and a more intimate level, I think, at a corporation. Whereas at a startup, you're talking about things that are affecting the entire business. For example, if you're a salesperson and you get that deal in, that might be, our first big deal or our only deal, or you're the only salesperson. So those are the things that are really impactful. The team like atmosphere at a startup, right? It's super close. Again, for better or worse. And I'm going to refrain from using the term family. It's not necessarily family, but you have to really have a high amount of trust. And at least these are the best teams. There's a lot of collaboration. You're working together constantly. It's a lot of camaraderie. You kind of feel like you're, in the trenches together. And, it can be, when it goes well, it's a super supportive environment. And when it doesn't, it feels incredibly chaotic and incredibly difficult to work with people who don't trust you. It's all the more, I think, telling of what your relationship is like with those around you. I've also worked at startup S company where I wasn't trusted very well, and frankly, like, they just weren't my people. It's a very uncomfortable environment. It's just uncomfortable, and it really honestly is not very productive either. So Yeah, live by the sword and die by the sword there too. Um, you know, with those small teams and highly collaborative teams, and again, kind of with that concept of like your high impact work, you're literally working probably right next to the CEO. You're doing things hand in hand. You definitely know the CEO. You definitely like are on calls regularly with them. Like you're in the mix of the executives, and maybe even potentially be an executive yourself, depending on your experience and whatever else. And so, it might not be something you've ever done before or had that comfortability with, and it can really throw people off. Depending on what the culture is and how relaxed or not relaxed it is, generally more relaxed at a startup. It might make you feel really weird, or you might not know how to behave or act. And it's something to get used to. It's something to think about, but it's also something that's super interesting because you really get to see the mindset of like how we make decisions at a high level and all sorts of cool things. And if you haven't ever dabbled in, the C-suite, you can get a chance to really be a part of it, quite literally, or at least experience what it's like. Just to kind of talk about like the fun, easy stuff. Like people always make jokes about like snacks and games and, pool tables and ping pong table, whatever. That can happen, especially at tech companies. Like I've worked at companies like that where there's ping pong tables and free lunch every day and snacks and, just this really like chill, like awesome perks. And we had like a masseuse come, and like there was all sorts of things that you could do. Awesome. Flexible hours, potentially more potential for remote, probably. There's, startups just have a much leaner cost structure. So the demand to go into the office isn't as high, and you can kind of come with a lot of like variety of perks. Now, again, that might be offset by, either your paycheck, or I mean something else that you kind of, it's a trade-off for sure. I think that like the last note that I have on that is like, it's just sort of a more personal experience. Like working at a startup is a little more tailored to like the environment where you do make friends at work, but you make friends everywhere, but like you're working so close together that the way that your life is bleeds into what the company is. And this is better or worse. And I think we kind of like transitioning into cons here. The work-life balance is not great. It's not great. And it is really tough sometimes to work for a small company because there's a lot to do. There's a lot to do, and you can be doing anything from quite literally taking out the trash and cleaning the toilets to writing email campaigns or, building code. It's kind of an all hands on deck situation. And again, with that, like camaraderie comes like there's a blurred lines between, your role. It's just ambiguous of exactly where your role ends and this person begins. There's a lot of tension that can happen because of that. Again, it's a lot of chaos and experimentation and not a lot of structure. So there is absolutely a willy-nilliness to it, that if you don't have kind of a flexible attitude, and there's kind of, this thing on the internet is like flexibility is kind of code for chaos. It's true. I mean, I think anybody who works at a startup and loves startups like me will say, like, for sure, it ain't perfect. It ain't for everyone. That kind of flexibility is also boundary pushing. And if you are somebody who is like, again, I'm talking like my sister in corporate life, she's like, I'm done at 5, like you don't exist anymore. It might not be for you. It might not be the right place for you. There's a lot of uncertainty. I was talking about options earlier and cashing those in or not. And there's uncertainty with that, but there's quite literally job insecurity almost constantly at a startup, because you're either raising capital or you're trying to grow. And so there's a lot of things that become contingent on like this one thing happening, changes that are happening all the time. Again, startups are just like in constant experimentation mode. And so there is the inherent risk and instability with that. And that's just the way it goes. The investors can suddenly say, like, oh, my favorite vitamin company, they were actually acquired by Bayer, and Bayer decided we're not funding this company anymore. And so like, I've been a customer of theirs for like 6 years. And anyway, they just pulled the plug on them. So look, of course that can happen at any time. It's stressful, man. It's very stressful, not just of that uncertainty and everything, but the workload. I mean, again, like I was saying, you're taking out the trash or whatever else, you have blurred lines, you can work some very long hours. It's really easy to get burnout. It's really easy to, really try, you have skin in the game. So you're really trying all your effort to make this business, their value increase and increase their value so that your options, are increased too. And that can lead to you really, burning the candle at both ends. It's high pressure. And again, just that work-life imbalance it can get to you, for sure. There's limited resources. Okay. At a corporate world, not that like budgets are unlimited and you're like, oh, I need this, I need that. But I mean, it's a scrappy mentality a lot of the time. It's minimal viable, right? And so you're definitely in a place where you don't have the infrastructure, operational efficiencies that you're going to, have things on like, like life insurance plans, other perks that are a little bit more robust, but also things like a desk stand and different things that is just like, sorry, dude, like we just use our books and we pile them up. Like that's the way it works. Like that's just the scrappy mentality that you kind of need right now. And to be in on that idea of scrappiness and minimal viable, but having the professional maturity to kind of understand that it's not like people are being cheap or, oh my gosh, we're completely out of money. I mean, that is always a risk when you're in a startup. So that kind of just sitting and being comfortable in those limited resources and that kind of cloud always kind of constantly hanging over. And again, it really depends on like what stage of the startup land that you're in here. But that it can feel like that. It can very much like be the reality of it. And yeah, I mean, listen, there's just a lack of structure. Like there just is. Like there's not probably a lot of documentation about how this works and what happens and everything. And generally startups get to the place when they're in more of a growth phase where they start, getting things a little more organized. But it's very much like, I don't know, like you're just making it up and you didn't necessarily write it down. So there's just a total lack of structure that, eventually comes to a head, but you have to sit through a lot of really difficulty before you get there. So anyway, that's the pros and cons of the startup land. Maybe, at another point, another video, we're going long here anyway. I'll go through the pros and cons, I think, of corporate life, although I don't know, I'm like probably the worst person to give the pros and cons of a corporate life. And since this person who wrote in, obviously you have 15 years of experience, you could probably write a video to me about the pros and cons there. I've already experienced my own, but I think at a high level, of course, it's stable. There's a lot more clarity on like job growth and whatnot, more resources, more networking opportunities, all this stuff, but all the things that you're probably tired of. I don't need to belabor either, but the bureaucracy and the kind of limited authority that you might feel, and maybe just like a boring corporate culture. Like you're just like, oh, this is boring. Like I have to be so like, where you can be a little bit more yourself or have a little bit more personality at work at a startup for the most part. And just, that clocking out at 5:00, like I don't hold that against you or anybody who like holds that boundary and really likes that life. I mean, there's a lot to be said for it. So, tough call, but I would say that, practically what you can do is, of course, meet up with folks, talk to folks, reach out to anybody, ask them for coffee, lunch, whatever it is that you can do, and ask about their life. Maybe go visit a campus, go see, what the deal is, talk about people's day to day. What do they love? What do they hate? And at the end of the day, apply to some jobs. Do some interviews. I mean, really, there's nothing wrong with you exploring other roles and taking a look. And it might just kind of scratch that itch for you so that at the end of the day, you're like, this is a huge pain in the ass. Like, I don't want to do this. And that's fair enough too. So scratch the itch to some degree and check it out. It's not necessarily a foregone conclusion, but hopefully I painted a picture of what generally it can be like. And then check it out. If there's a cool company that you're just like, man, I just like have a feeling about this, go for it. I'm a huge fan of taking risks. And so if you're asking me, I say go for it. But again, I'm that startup person. It ain't for everyone. And hopefully this makes you decide if it's for you or not. So thank you for joining the Blink Weekly Newsletter. Again, I'm Bianca Lager, and I will see you next week. Bye now.